The lady yields back chair. Thanks, the gentlelady. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I thank my colleague from Texas. I would ask my friend, Mr. Diaz-Ballard, if he is in agreement that, notwithstanding the statements made about recent revelations of IRS going out and finding untold dollars from the wealthy, that according to the studies that we've all looked at and seen, for example, CBS, quote, IRS audits the poor at 5 times the rate of everyone else. The New York Times, quote, black taxpayers are at least 3 times as likely to be audited by the Internal Revenue Service as other taxpayers, that the extent to which if you beef up the Internal Revenue Service to target the American people, to squeeze blood from a turnip, where is that likely to come from?
Well, I thank the gentleman from hardworking, middle-class, and working-class Americans.
Correct. Not
from the wealthy, from hardworking, middle-class, and working-class Americans. And again, Mr. Roy, the American people are really wise. And, you know, if anybody thinks that somehow hiring almost 100,000 additional bureaucrats in the IRS, first place is good policy, and second place is going to save money, really, that's when you know we've been in Washington too long listening to this craziness. Hiring almost 100,000 new additional bureaucrats is going to cost a heck of a lot of money, and never are they going to make up for that additional expense that the taxpayer is going to get stuck with, number one, and number two, then they're going to have audits after audits on working class, middle class, small businesses, end of story. And the American people know that, and Mr. Roy, so do you, so thank you for that question.
Yeah, and I assume the gentleman probably does not know, my father worked for the Internal Revenue Service for 24 years. I have no beef with individuals who are public servants and who are engaged in the job of collecting revenue for the United States Treasury. My beef is with the expansion of the Internal Revenue Service. The gentleman, the chairman, talked about quote, collect taxes, duly owed to the Treasury, right? My constituents have to pay taxes. Oh, I guess my constituents would love to learn that they apparently don't have to pay taxes. My constituents in Central Texas and Texas 21 apparently are, scot-free on the tax front. So I can promise you when I go around Texas, not one constituent across the spectrum has asked me to expand the Internal Revenue Service. And I can promise you that if I go out and talk to my constituents and I say, let me ask you a question. Do you think that it would be wise for Congress to choose the Internal Revenue Service expansion over supporting Israel? I know what they would say, because that's what my Democrat colleagues want to do. They want to prioritize expansion of the Internal Revenue Service to target the American people rather than support Israel. Because my Democratic colleagues have never met an expenditure that they're not willing to make, irrespective of whether it's paid for. Because it doesn't matter, as we walked through in the previous panel. At revenues at an all-time high, they never fail to find an excuse by which it is always the fault of some tax bill, despite the fact that revenues are at an all-time high to the Treasury, according to the Federal Reserve. I would ask my colleague from Florida if the gentleman is aware that the Fiscal Responsibility Act, the debt deal from Memorial Day, that the president signed, rescinded $1.4 billion in Internal Revenue Service funding, if the gentleman recalls correctly. Further, that there were a number of agreements to repurpose billions of IRS funding in the conversations about how to manage and get through the rescissions to deal with managing our debt situation. So this is nothing new. Would the gentleman agree?
I would agree. The gentleman from Texas has made a very valid point. But that's just one of the points. The other thing is that this bill funds what Israel is asking for.
Correct.
I keep hearing somehow that it doesn't take care of Israel. No, what it doesn't do is a bunch of other things that we'll have ample opportunity and time to deal with, and they may be good, they may not be that good. But this bill focuses on one thing and one thing alone, to get Israel what Israel needs. Now, I also would like to bring up that, we recently, and I want to thank the gentleman for his support, and actually and the chairman as well, passed the State and Foreign Operations Bill.
Yes, sir.
And that fully funds the United States MOU with Israel, $3.3 billion. All Democrats voted against that. It defunds the Office of Palestinian Affairs. All of my colleagues from the other side of the aisle voted against that.
Right.
It prohibits funds for Hamas and no funds for the Palestinian Authority consistent with the Taylor Force Act. They all voted against that as well.
Yes, indeed.
But there is one good thing that I've heard today, if I may, because we've heard a lot about other things other than funding Israel that maybe should be in this bill. And one of the things I keep hearing a lot about is Ukraine, and that's great. But then I was, we heard right now, well, let's get back to the beginning. We've always been behind Ukraine. Well, let's get back to the beginning, if we may. Have we all forgotten the attitude and the policy of then President Obama at the beginning of his presidency and Secretary of State Clinton after Putin had invaded Georgia? Do you remember the reset button? That has not aged well. If we go to the beginning, the Democrats, unfortunately, were dead wrong on Ukraine, but that's not what we're talking about here today. Let's not try to confuse the issue. This bill fully funds what Israel is asking for and needs. That's what it does. It's true, it doesn't have a lot of other issues, which I repeat, we'll have ample opportunity to deal with. If you're concerned about the situation in Israel, here's the opportunity. We had one opportunity before this horrific attack by Hamas on Israel to help Israel with the State Foreign Ops Bill. We have another opportunity now, Israel being at war, to help Israel, to not confuse the issue. Here it is. And the excuses that you can't do offsets when, I just pointed out, a bill by the Democrats that did offsets, a supplemental. Again, it's excuse after excuse. Here's the bottom line. Let's get back to the business of helping Israel. This bill does it. It does it 100%. It's everything Israel wants. It's everything Israel needs right now. And we can get it off the floor, send it to the Senate and to the President's desk pronto, inmediatamente, if we get serious.
Would the gentleman agree that we have a bill before us that would actually expedite ensuring that we get funding for Israel because it is not encumbered by other issues that would raise certain debates, all deserving of debate. For example, Ukraine and other funding, issues involving the border, issues involving Taiwan, all complex issues, but that getting a Israel-only focused bill that is responsibly paid for, and to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, we already talked about the IRS funding and the issue of the CBO. The gentleman from Virginia reminded me that at one point, I think he put forward a bill that would have Holman ruled and rescinded a lot of the CBO employees and frankly cut a lot of the CBO, and the CBO said that it would have had no fiscal impact. Look, I mean, this is the reality we're dealing with here. We had the CBO who said that the drug price fixing that was in the Inflation Reduction Act would yield $100 billion to our Treasury, notwithstanding the impact that it has on innovation, utterly destroying what's going on in oncology right now. Drugs for cancer getting crushed by this drug price fixing. Drugs, by the way, that saved my life 11 years ago, some of which may not be around to save other people's lives because of government meddling. And that's really what's going on. So our Democrat friends want to protect the legislation that they put forward that is destroying innovation, undermining the ability of the American economy to produce American energy, saddling up with China, undermining our ability to actually stand up for Ukraine with strong American energy, while coming up and saying, no, we've got to keep writing blank checks. Well, guess what? The American people are tired of blank checks. I know we've got some more questions to get to. I'll just want to just say a couple other things in your State and Foreign Operations Bill.
Yes, sir.
That you mentioned. If I remember correctly, there's a significant number of entities that we restricted funding on, which, of course, we've passed but have not been moved on by the Senate. But so my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are so wed to the promotion of the Internal Revenue Service expansion. By the way, it's not a cut to the IRS. It's a reduction of the expansion of the pool of money set aside to make the IRS bigger. So everybody in America, I just want you to understand, my Democratic colleagues want the IRS to be bigger and more powerful to go after you. And they would choose that over Israel. But let's just say that we say, okay, fine. Our Democratic colleagues are all wound up about the CBO, and they're all in love with the IRS. Okay, you want to protect your IRS? Hey, there's $12.5 billion at the United Nations, sitting right there The UN literally just rejected a motion to condemn Hamas terrorists. The United Nations. A recent report found UNRWA schools in the West Bank and Gaza, quote, regularly call for the murder of Jews and create teaching materials that glorify terrorism, encourage martyrdom, demonize Israelis, and incite anti-Semitism. The UN Human Rights Council includes members like China, Cuba, Eritrea, and since 2015 has condemned Israel 112 times and China 0 times. Could the gentleman elaborate on the extent to which you found savings in SFOPs that frankly might be meritorious right now if we wanted to pay for something that would directly help Israel while paying for the additional expenditures?
Well, thank you, Mr. Roy, and I think the opposition to that bill is not aging well, if I may say so,
Right.
because we did reduce spending rather dramatically, but it wasn't at the expense of U.S. national security.
Correct.
Just the opposite. It was to eliminate funding or reduce funding from entities that are actually hurting our national security interests and that of our allies. So while we reduce spending, we put $1 billion more than the president could find with his radical spending increases, but we still put $1 billion more than the president could find to confront China, for example. But we also defund the Office of Palestinian Affairs. That's where we got the money. You just mentioned UNRWA. We prohibit funding for the United Nations International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territories. We've got conditionality on anti-Israel actions taken by the International Court of Justice, which is constant, as you just mentioned. UNRWA prohibits assessed contributions to the UN Relief and Workers Agency, UNRWA, while strengthening oversight requirements and conditions on preventing UNRWA facilities, I know this is controversial for some, preventing them from being used by terrorists and addressing incitement of violence and anti-Semitism. Was that spot on, Mr. Roy, in that bill? And that's why I thank you for your support. It prohibits funds, obviously, for example, to move the embassy out of Jerusalem. Now, I will tell you, I was there that day in the opening of the embassy. Yep. And a lot of folks promised it. It was delivered by President Trump. And so I can go on and on and on, where we reduced funding to entities that hurt our national security and hurt our allies, particularly Israel, and yet were able to then find more funding at a reduced overall level to confront China, to help our allies. That's the way the American people do their budgets every single month. We should do the same.
One final question. One of my colleagues said that we are, quote, providing aid and comfort to Vladimir Putin by putting forward a piece of legislation directly focused on funding Israel, paid for by a massive expansion of the Internal Revenue Service. Do you find that as offensive as I do, when in fact what we're talking about is having a separate and clear and full and honest and open debate and accounting of the dollars that have already flowed to Ukraine, that would flow to Ukraine, clarity on the mission so that we can understand our role and engagement when we've already spent $113 billion in Ukraine. And if you add to that the president's request for Ukraine now of almost $60 billion, that would be $170 billion, which almost matches to the dollar the total we've given to Israel for the entire history of Israel. So do you find it equally as offensive as I do that such a charge would be made that we are providing aid and comfort to Vladimir Putin for daring to believe in a bill on Israel should be independent by itself and funded and paid for the American people?
You know, sir, the fact speaks for itself. We are doing exactly what Israel is asking for. We're doing it clearly, quickly, in a transparent way so everybody can see where the money goes and what it's for. Israel needs it right now. We are acting right now. I'm grateful to the Speaker, to the Majority Leader for bringing this bill forward. And yes, that's what this bill does. There's ample opportunities to talk about other issues, but I think we should be transparent to the American people and saying we support Israel. We're with them at this very difficult moment, and we're immediately going to pass this bill with all of the funding that they have requested. But yes, we're not adding it and doing a Christmas tree with it, which is unfortunately what the president is attempting to do.
Thank you, gentlemen. I yield back.